Well, thank you. I just want to make sure I got the buttons right here, so I go down. So I'm going to talk, and by the way, as I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me or say something, or I know you're going to say something, right? Of course, sure. And it's fine because this is obviously informal and willing to discuss and wherever we go. I want to look at the memory of war. It's been a scholarly topic that has exploded in interest over the last probably 15 or 20 years in ways that didn't exist before, at least from a scholarly point of view. And I want to sort of stress in this presentation that I'm going to be looking at what I call popular memory, the way people experience war and remember their experiences in all kinds of ways. And of course, I don't have enough time to do all of that today, or look at all the ways that people remember and experience warfare. But from our discussion this morning, I think we all pretty much agreement that there's variety. And even though some people would like to say that one war is particularly good or bad or make some neat and clean statement about what a war involved, if you talk to enough veterans or you talk to enough civilians or you talk to enough people involved with wars, you're going to get a lot of points of view. And that's important because the memory of war is constantly subjected to cross currents. And those cross currents include not only the insistence by some people that a war be remembered in a highly moral or honorable or concise way, with removing many of the contradictions. And on the opposite side, you've got all these innumerable expressions by people who have experiences to talk about, which are varied and not always amenable, not only to sort of neat and clean or coherent statements, such as World War II is a good war, but are insistent that people listen to what they have to say because they're coming from positions that are driven to a large extent, often to a large extent, by very difficult experiences with pain, trauma, and suffering. And so I'm oversimplifying, but mostly you'll see in the presentation today that constant tension, and I think something you can certainly talk about in your workshops going forward, between the effort to not only moralize, but make the understanding of our wars more concise against the variety of emotions and feelings, that's why I talk about memories and feelings, that people experienced. Some say that the all-volunteer force, which we have now, basically has insulated us more from the realities of trauma and pain of war, so that, for example, so much a larger percentage of the population was involved in World War II. Therefore, a lot more families are reckoning with the pain, the suffering, the loss of loved ones, et cetera. And today, some people would argue, you can argue this, that we're more insulated from this because it's a very small portion of the population that volunteers and goes off to Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, most of us are sitting here reading books, right? And we're not out there dealing with stuff like you talk about, right? So it's real, but it's often sort of diluted by the sort of separation between our life experiences and yours. I put in Moyne there because I happen to be reading Moyne, one of your readings, but you're not going to talk about that today. So why is it important? Well, there's a lot of reasons why the study of and the consideration of diverse memories of war is important. And first of all, and there's more than I can put on a slide, but national identity. So do Americans want to think that they're just undertake good wars, just wars, save the world from Hitler, which I will argue was a very good thing, liberate the camps, or do they want to be remembered for wars that didn't seem to have such a noble end game or outcome? Although I think we've already suggested that this morning that in all wars, and I would say that there is a mixture of politics, feelings, arguments that make it imperative for those who want neat and concise or patriotic versions of war that they try to edit out some of that complexity and some of that pain. If you're going to talk too much about wars as being bad or traumatic or wreaking havoc or killing innocent civilians, then you're going to raise an issue of culpability. Well, then who ordered this? Who's responsible for this stuff? And that and who's responsible not only for the killing of innocent people in Iraq, if you will, but all the traumatic brain injuries that I mean, you know. So do we blame the Iraqis for that, or do we blame? I'm not taking a side here. I'm saying, or do you want to blame the people who decided to go into Iraq in the first place? I think it was you, Heather, this morning that used the term, of course, invasion of Iraq. Well, there are people who would not want you to say invasion of Iraq, right? Fair? You know, they would not want to see it in a less flattering way. And the idea that the more we sort of begin to talk a lot about our pain and suffering in society, even if it's coming from veterans or wars or veterans' families, to me raises a larger question of how do we deal with pain and the suffering of other people in our societies. You may not be a veteran, you may be a disabled person somewhere who is suffering, or there's all kinds of ways to suffer. So I think it's potentially connected to the sense of, to the extent to which as a society we should sort of feel responsible or sympathetic or empathetic to those that suffer. And finally, there's this politics of wars, which I won't talk about a lot today, but if wars are filled with pain and loss and suffering, if you send off, 30,000 or 58,000 of your men and women to Vietnam and they don't come back alive, is there anything we can derive that's positive from that? And that's the idea of remediation or redress. In other words, can we take the experience of human suffering and turn it into something more positive over time? And I just put that, it's just like, History 101. But I mean, the classic case of remediation is the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln stands on the bloodiest battlefield ever in North America. We're not supposed to talk about the Civil War, right? And he basically asked the question, why did all these people die? I mean, there's thousands. I mean, I forget the one day total, some of you know that, but it's astronomical almost. And he said, so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. But what he's saying is if you're going to go through all that goddamn killing and suffering, for God's sake, work towards a better and more just society. And I think you'll notice as I go through this, watch how many times the memory of war really doesn't get to that point. It doesn't make that claim, and probably maybe as much as it should. That's where if you want to talk about just wars, it's not whether you're justified in getting into it. It's what sort of just society can you create from the memory of the horror and the pain, so the stuff doesn't happen again. And that's why I really like that. And if you're interested, there's great articles, usually by anthropologists or historians, about remediation and violence. It's just good stuff. So there's all kinds of ways we've remembered war. And somebody like me could sit here for 2 days and just show you paintings like that, but you don't want to do that, right? I mean, you got lives to live. So that's John Stuart Curry's painting, the Return of Private Davis from the Argonne. That's a memory of World War I. He painted it in 1940, but he worked on it for 13 years, and he had a friend, either from Kansas, that died in the Argonne. He didn't know. He just kept trying to figure out how best to remember and pay his respects, as I suggest. And as you can see, in some ways to me, it's a sort of a riveting painting, but they're in a field in Kansas, and there's obviously the flag-draped coffin, the dead soldier, but everybody his death is honorable. There's the flags, there's other soldiers, there's people bowing their heads, there's a preacher invoking some sort of prayer. Some people analyze the painting and say, well, there's some sort of godly sense of sunlight streaming from the clouds. Well, what all that stuff is fine, but the point is that he died in the war, and it was an honorable undertaking. And there may be trauma, there may be people in that audience that are suffering deeply, but that's not what that painting is about. And you're getting your first sense of that sort of continual issue of displaying or raising the idea of honor, not only because there may have been honor and there may have been a valid reason that that death should be honored and it was of the highest, order of what had to be done, but it does tend to sort of erase a little bit the sort of total disarray of traumatic memories or people's lives that have been ruined. So there's another review of war. That's at the Indy 500. I couldn't resist that one. When I thought of the Indy 500, and I haven't been there a lot. I've been to a few races. Those of you who've gone there, they bring the jets down the runway or stealth bombers or whatever. But one of the ways of, and won't do that a lot today, but one of the memories of war is this exaltation of our military hardware. And that often comes, you see a lot of World War II memorials in small towns where there's just a tank, just a tank. Or sometimes a tank and a list of the people who died, right? So what do you make of that? Well, what do you make of it? I don't even know if it's honoring. It's just sort of like maybe it's masculinity, I'll look down at my expert down there, but anyhow, it's the weapons. And I have to watch myself and not digress, but there's a great 1952 movie with Jimmy Stewart, Strategic Air Command, where he flew bombers in World War II, and he's now in civilian life in the 50s, and he's asked to come back into the Air Force, and June Allyson is his wife in the movie, and she says, and he has to break it to her gently that he's going to leave their domestic bliss and go back and he takes her out to look at the airfield to see these bombers, and he says to her without any sort of irony, "Isn't that the most beautiful thing you ever saw?" I still laugh when I think of that scene. And June says yes, of course, is the compliant wife. So, sorry. Okay. And now we get a little bit more realism, right? That's a photo from Khe Sanh. Those of you who know Vietnam know that Khe Sanh was after the war, and some of you may know this better than me, a very controversial battle. There's a lot of veterans from Vietnam who would not be happy with the story of Khe Sanh. They fought and died there for 77 days. That's a graphic picture. I sort of like that in many ways for that sort of feelings that it shows. Painful realities, I call them. And then after we took the troops out of that position, the American the generals abandoned it. So the troops were saying, well, why do we defend it? Why do we fight for so long? And it's a long story, which I can't get into. That's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and this again is a sort of a memory of war or depiction of war that is the counter opposite of the photograph from Khe Sanh, right? I mean, you're diminishing the impact of the painful realities. You're creating something that's artistic, honorable, somber, more aesthetically artistic than the painting of Curry's painting, etc. But there's a need, and the government has a need to convey the idea that those, what's the death toll from U.S. death toll, 100,000 or so, give or take, for World War I, that is an honorable undertaking, and to tamp down memories that might be more critical. And there were after World War I. Make no mistake, before Vietnam is not the first war where there's fierce controversies in this country over the dying and the killing and the decisions. The Civil War really introduced us to this sort of idea of making dying for your country noble. It didn't, from the literature on that, the identification with soldiers before the Civil War, they were usually in state organizations, state militias, and there was a sort of honor to that at a state level, but you didn't have the sort of widespread national effort to bring patriotic glory to dying for the country with the Civil War, which of course cries out for that because there's so much human slaughter both in the North and the South. And in the 20th century, that pursuit of honor over trauma, covering the trauma, as I say, increases substantially. So we talked this morning about that's an extension in the 1920s, just like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That's Indianapolis. Some of you have been there. Maybe some of you are, I think, Jason, you're taking students there. If you've ever been inside of that thing, it has a sort of religious temple aesthetic to it. If you've ever been inside, it's dark and somber. You've been in there, and it's been a number of years. But when I was in there, they had the names of all the Indiana people who served in there. Right, they're still there. So they're conveying a sort of a religious distinction and quality to your service to the nation. I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that that was the mindset of this way of remembering war and remembering suffering in honorable ways. So there we're going back to this sort of honorific way of talking about an experienced war, and that many of you have probably been there. There's honor flights going there all the time. That's the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 2004. And there the trauma is pretty well tamped down a bit. The 400,000 Americans, as you know, are represented by gold stars. And then each of those big columns at the bottom and the top, those are victory arches, one for the Atlantic Theater of Operations, one for the Pacific. And then all those pillars around there, if you've been there, they're celebrating the rules of the various states and territories. I think there's like 56 or 57, et cetera. So right now I'm focusing on memorials that go for honor. And remember, it's not only honor in terms of dishonor or good versus bad, it's also an attempt to make a concise statement of what the war is about that takes away the complexity. And so it's not just tamping down feelings, it's trying to tamp complexity away and make it, which is basically mythical. Now, that's, if you go to New Mexico, you don't get that sort of erasure of the suffering, because before World War II, thousands of National Guard troops from New Mexico had been sent to the Philippines before Pearl Harbor. And thinking, in fact, many of those guys thought that, I'm glad I'm going there because it looks like a war's going to break out in Europe with Hitler. And sure enough, they get to Asia and yikes, there's Pearl Harbor and they're trapped. And so there's a couple thousand New Mexico National Guardsmen become POWs during the war. So they're good wars in prison camps in the Philippines or Japan. Not a good story. I don't have to elaborate. I mean, it's bad stuff. I mean, whatever you think you had a bad war, you didn't want to be in one of those camps. Many of them didn't make it out alive. And when I found this, I have to say, as a historian, it was one of the more exciting times of my life, because I didn't know this, and I don't think most people did at that time. So I said, geez, I got to get on the plane to New Mexico. And so I started to track it down. Well, I found at least 7 or 8 or 9, 10 memorials throughout the state. It's not a populated state like that. And what they're showing you, or what they want to say is, we were prisoners of war and we only got through by helping each other. And those are the POWs. That's beautiful. That's in Las Cruces. And I said, oh my God, what about the good war? Sorry. It's not what it was about there. So, I mean, there is the pain and the brotherhood and the suffering that's coming through, and it's replicated a number of times. And they had ceremonies in New Mexico. I'm sorry, I don't want to digress too much, but they had marches. They remembered that suffering for 50 years. There was a veteran who got up a year after he got home in 46, walked down to the state capitol building in Santa Fe and took down the American flag and raised a flag of surrender, because the American flag is not allowing us to remember the prisoners and their suffering in the POW. It was a statement, listen to my trauma. So I said, very seldom do you get in the memorials a sort of connection to the possible positive political outcomes. That's a memorial to the 4 freedoms. It's in a neighborhood in Cleveland where you could spend a year, 10 years in Cleveland and never find it. But the thing is that in the rhetoric of the 40s in World War II, it was a war for the 4 freedoms. It was democracy versus fascism. Freedom from speech or worship, from want, from fear. I mean, that was all aimed at fascism. And you don't get that in the World War II Memorial in Washington. I mean, where's the democracy? Where was Roosevelt's speech? You don't even get much of Roosevelt there. which is another story. But, and I always sort of like the story of the freedom from want, because in Evansville, Indiana, there's a memorial, I won't get into it, on World War II that does mention the 4 freedoms, but they took out freedom from want because conservatives in Evansville felt that it sort of backed the idea of a welfare state. And so, you know, here we go. I change it. So that's a wreath on a field on Alexandria, Louisiana, probably not far from you. But Alexandria was a hotbed of GI training in World War II. There were, I don't know how many bases around there. And so on Saturday night in Alexandria in 42 and 43, there were all kinds of soldiers in town on Saturday night. There was a black section and a white section. And somebody said there was disorder, whatever, in the black section. And Louisiana State Police and MPs surrounded the black section and started shooting to quell the disorder. And the black community for years afterward argued that their memory of the war in that area was not about a good war. It was about 17 or whatever black African Americans they thought were killed, and the government said, no, nobody was killed. And then there were stories that the government brought in funeral director, guys who could embalm bodies, and they took them out silently on a train. I followed that debate for years in my research, and I could never come to a conclusive point about how many may have died, but I could conclusively say that they argued about it forever. In other words, that it was not a good war. And that wreath is put there every year and has been for years and years by a lady named Etta Compton, who I got to know when I was down there 12, 13 years ago, who commemorates the dead. So for the African American community in Louisiana, they were dead. For the government, they weren't dead. And that was part of what I was trying to show in terms of the good war wasn't so good everywhere you went. And you can change it. However, there's a more heroic view of African Americans in World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen, which probably everybody in this room knows about. They dedicated that memorial at the Air Force Academy in 1988, and the Tuskegee Airmen were in the mix. You know, they were flying protection for bombers over Central Europe. So that there's no doubt they were in dangerous territory for sure. I mean, you can change it. And of course, you all know the Vietnam Wall, of course, which is seen now as the quintessential statement of war. It could be honorific. It could be for stopping communism or creating a more democratic world. I guess you could take anything, but clearly it's been mostly about the tragedy and the loss. I mean, that's why you get feelings. You don't get feelings as much. You get at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but there you get it, and you all know the story. But the conservatives didn't like it. They called it a black gash of shame because you're only talking about war's death, and that's always problematic for people who want to remember the courage and the bravery. And I'm not saying that stuff didn't exist, or the honor of serving your country. You can change it. So as you all know, and those of you in Vietnam, so we've had movements to add to the wall and the death by showing the role of nurses as caregivers, and they clearly were. Heather's written about that. And they wanted some real living soldiers, guys who fought. And so they've added that, and as you know the story, the guys on the right, one is supposed to be Caucasian, Hispanic, and African American, and they're turning back, looking at their dead brethren thing. I mean, it's sort of a great memorial in many ways. I mean, absolutely. But you can see the tensions in how you remember the war experiences, which is what we're talking about. You can change it. And so there we're back to the weapons. That's a Vietnam memorial in Long Beach, California. And now it's like the tanks from World War II, and what military vehicle was so predominant. You all know that in Vietnam, and you probably heard this 100 times, 1,000 times. It's the helicopters. So there, it's more about the fighting, our weapons, a little bit, and less about an abstract sense of either honor or loss, even for that matter. Although there's a plaque there with the names of the dead, the local dead in Long Beach. Oh yeah, you can change it. Sorry, I keep saying that. I don't want to spend too much time on my text. So I mean, but the public remembrance of the war is see is often filtered through these images of either patriotic honor or personal reflections, and the personal reflections are very varied, which you're about to see. And I just wanted to raise quickly, and this may come up in your talks, that I think we've reached a point in our culture where when we look at soldiers or remember their war experiences as being a process of victimization, where they come home with traumatic brain injuries or some other issues, etc., I think it's beginning to bleed possibly into the idea of victimization in this time and place. Because victimization in our times, in my opinion, is something that could definitely evoke sympathy, but also resentment. So much of our politics is driven by the fact that some people feel they're victims and other people refuse to accept that and resent that because they think they're being favored by government programs, etc. That certainly comes out in terms of race relations. So I won't, just raising the issue, we could talk about more of it later. Thanks. So you go back to the World War II memorial, and they have these little panels on the side of it. You know, I just showed you the overview with the victory arches and the pillars. And I just want to talk for a few minutes about Pearl Harbor. This is there's two panels on the side of the World War II memorial dealing with Pearl Harbor. The first one is the American family sitting down, listening to the radio. It's a Sunday. We all have seen it in the movies 100 times. And they're getting the news the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And there the war is serious Americans hearing serious, troubling news, etc. But there's sort of, nobody's going crazy, nobody's sort of getting overly emotional, they're hearing. I mean, if you watch movies from the 40s and 50s, I lost count, that scene is replicated in, God knows, somebody should write an article on how many movies it's replicated in. You go to the next. That's the second Pearl Harbor panel, and now that is, it's a darker image, harder to see, but these are now the American men who are in those households listening to the news. They're lining up their induction, and at the end of it, I don't have enough room, they have their uniforms on, they're going off to war. Again, there's no resentment, there's no fear, you'll see what's left out in a minute. Americans hear it, they're dutiful, they're patriotic. These are basically the images of the greatest generation. They are ready to go, and they're not really fussing about it. That's 1991, that's the 50th anniversary, and there's a big celebration in Honolulu. George Bush Sr. is not going to apologize for Pearl Harbor, and the veterans are marching, and it's glorious. I mean, the crowd started singing spontaneously, God Bless America. There's reason to celebrate the end of a war and a triumph, I can understand that, but it's not, again, the pain and suffering and the trauma, etc. Okay, so what else is missing from those panels? Well, the sort of violent nature of a response. I mean, there were a lot of Americans, as you know, who signed up to simply enter the service then because they wanted to kill Japs. That was just part of what was going on. And I'm not saying it's not understandable, I'm just saying that we try to sort of lead the emotional complexity of wartime and the war experience. Another one. There we tame the trauma a little bit. That's everybody knows this. That's the hull of the USS Arizona. There's still, 1,700, give or take. They never took the bodies out of there, okay? Those are just the remaining. Veterans, I don't know if there's still room, but a veteran up until recently who was there could elect to be buried there with his comrades. But you have the memorial over it, which allows for the trauma to come in. But again, it's sort of like Curry's painting. It's sort of reflective. It's somber. It's uplifting. You can't see it here, but the architectural shape of that memorial is high in the sides, and it's a bow in the middle. It's supposed to reflect architecturally that America took the blows, it bent back, and then it rose to the heights after it was in. So this is sort of, it's victory, it's honorable, and it's allowing that it wasn't, a lot of people died for this, but it tries to put the horror in a more acceptable light. Okay, so just about 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, they finally began to figure out how to use DNA to process bones and find out who these bones belong to. Well, one of the ships at Pearl Harbor, the USS Oklahoma, was just simply blown up and turned over on its side. And throughout the war, people sailing in and out of Pearl Harbor, it was just there. They could see the hull, the ship. They never got the guys out of there. I mean, you couldn't get them out, okay? So after the war, they eventually just built these huge piles of bones and buried them. I'm misremembering slightly here, but it might have just been skulls in one thing and leg bones in another. I mean, it is what it was, etc. But once they realized they could identify people through DNA, that the military decided to do that, and they started this process, which you see here, of trying to identify. And what I found interesting about that, as I started to follow up on it a little bit recently, was that, you can hit it again, all of a sudden we're getting news releases, which we never had before, of these families after, 50, 60 years, saying, hey, we just identified your father or your uncle or your brother or whatever, and here's the honor we're bringing back. And the news stories are now telling us how these people suffered for years and we never read about them or heard about them, etc. I'm not doing it justice here in terms of what, and they're telling stories, you can hit it, yeah, like that. I mean, so, you could start Googling this stuff and starting reading these news articles, and we're hearing stories, oh, my mother sat in a chair for the rest of her life and put a picture there waiting for him to return. Or we got together every year and we drank in honor of him. And there were stories of family members who never knew my uncle who was killed at Pearl Harbor, and I did a lot of work on it. And when the news came after 60 years that they finally found his bones, they just broke down. It's really emotional to read this and to think that they were going through this for 60 or 7 years, and that was never really part of the experience. Never part of our memory of the war itself. Okay, so obviously I'm a pain person, and I'm into that stuff, and so I look for it. But you get a lot of the painful memories of war through journalism. You don't get it as much through obviously public memorials, etc., or formal sort of ceremonies. And so that's a classic one of a widow, obviously, from, I think it's Iraq. Said War and Terror, I think she was an Iraq widow, etc. There's been many documentaries made in the War and Terror, and if there was one common theme I saw, and God knows how many I watched, it's about shattered families. So the documentarians are totally on this, and we'll see how that plays out in terms of the memory of this war going forward. You can hit it. So that's another photojournalist. I think I won an award. Kathy is a war widow. She's sleeping by. Did you ever see that?
I've seen this.
That's a great shot. And she's sleeping by. She wants to spend one more night. You can't see it there. I think she brought it on a laptop and was playing the music that he liked before. It's heart-wrenching to see that. But you want to talk the war experience, you're getting some of that. You can hit it. So I want to talk a bit about Gary Sinise. He was in Forrest Gump, and he's been in TV shows, and he's been organizing, I'm not sure he's still doing it, shows for vets all over the country, thanking them for their service, all well and good. They usually often bring in Lee Greenwood to sing I'm Proud to Be an American. So I started to look into Sinise, and I found this book, maybe some of you know it, you can hit it. It's by Zoe Wool. It's called After War. She's an anthropologist who spent a couple years at Walter Reed Hospital living with the wounded vets and their families. And she's got a great section there of all these vets who wouldn't go to Sinise's concerts. They bring Sinise in to thank the veterans because they felt that the patriotic honors didn't properly acknowledge the suffering and the damage they felt the war did to their lives and their careers. And they would stay in another room, etc. I mean, it's really interesting to read how we're praising the vets, and some people are thankful for that honor, and that's fine, but it wasn't working for everybody. And I put it up there because some of you may want to read that book. It's quite well done. You can hit it. You can hit it again. I just said what she just did. This is real quick, but the beginning of the war in Terror, I guess you could argue, is 9/11. There's a story about two two women whose spouses were on Flight 93. Those of you know, Flight 93 was the one where the passengers tried to take back the plane from the terrorists, crashed in Pennsylvania. There's quite a large memorial there now at Shanksville. And in Lisa Beamer's book, it was her husband, Todd Beamer, that said, "Let's roll." And Bush would always say, "Let's roll. And we're going to take back the plane," okay. And she saw that as, she was very proud of him. She said he did it out of patriotism and also because he wanted to try to get the plane and get back to his family that he loved. He was mentioned by Bush in his 2002 State of the Union talk, and he called these men patriots. Now go to the next slide. Okay, so Liz Glick, her husband's on the same flight, and he's part of the group that's rushing the terrorists too, and she's livid at Bush and the effort to turn her husband's actions into patriotic heroism, because she said the only reason he was trying to do that was to get back to his family. And she actually got upset and was critical of Bush for taking her personal pain and trying to put it in the service of a national cause. I'm not taking sides with these women at all. I mean, you can think whatever you think of this stuff. My point here is I'm showing contradictions. And I'm showing that people don't react to this. And I'm showing that patriotic honor is frequently insufficient to address the real pain and suffering that people have from their war experiences. And that's sort of, with me, bottom line. Okay, you can hit it. So Cindy Sheehan is this always, I thought so interesting. So her son is killed in Iraq. I mean, if you read her autobiography, you know, when she hears the news, forget patriotism, she fell to the floor and started kicking and screaming for hours. I mean, excuse me. So she sets up a camp near Bush's ranch in Texas, near Waco in 2005. And Fox News goes, and this is just so interesting about the tension between patriotism and pain. Fox News calls her a crackpot, and Bill O'Reilly, who was on Fox News in those days, said she's been taken over by far left elements, as if you had to be a far leftist, and you could even be a conservative rightist, right, to cry and scream in public over the death of your son in war. I mean, you can hit it. So that's her good, Sheehan's good sort of compadre in helping her organize Celeste Zapala. Her son was the first National Guardsman from Pennsylvania in years since World War II, killed in Iraq. And she's written very well about the anger she felt at going to her son's funeral, because it was all about the patriotic rhetoric and not about her pain. She said, I didn't say it, that she felt it didn't sufficiently address the sense of loss and tragedy. She was just inconsolable over that. She was at Camp Casey, but Sheehan as well. Go ahead. So at Camp Casey, they went near Bush's ranch. They put crosses in the ground to commemorate the Iraqi and Afghanistan dead, whatever the numbers were at that time. And a local guy from Waco comes with his pickup truck at night, and he runs the crosses over. I mean, he did not want the idea of dying for your country to be anything less than honorable. And I'm in no way saying that it's not honorable. And don't say that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is a debate. You know, when you come, if you're into this with your sessions, this is a constant debate, etc. You can hit it. So another group comes to Camp Casey, and they build another camp, Honor versus Pain, and they line up sides on one side of the road. I think that road's probably headed to or from Bush's ranch, and support our troops. This is Bush country. They see the critique. They see the deployment of the dead and the tragedy of the war as a critique against Bush's policies, as well as one of honor. And on the other side, you can still see somebody put crosses up. So, I mean, there's the visualization of this honor versus pain, and this sort of interesting situation where you've got Gold Star mothers actually arguing with each other over the meaning of their experience of the war. You can hit it again. I'll just pause my thing. Am I going okay here? Yeah, you tell me when to stop. But
you have 15 minutes. No,
yeah, we can do another 15 hours if you want. But anyhow, so if you listen to the stories soldiers say, I would say by and large, soldiers basically write critical versions of war. And I don't care what war you're talking about, by the way. I don't care if it's World War I. One of the first memoirs of a soldier memoir from World War I, it's made into a movie, is about this guy who loses a limb and he wants to talk about what he lost. So it's a long tradition, and to reveal the trauma or displeasure with the military. And so Brokaw in the Good War is basically, has a bestseller. It's the greatest generation. It's a good war. I'm not saying there was nothing good about it, and certainly the defeat of fascism. But no, by the way, no one dies in that book. I read it a second time. I said, no, that's not. No, Americans went crazy for a war without death, etc. That's the way they want to remember it. You can hit it. So Norman Mailer in 1948 writes probably the best novel in World War II, and he's very critical of the American capacity for violence. Now, Mailer is a vet. Mailer walked through Nagasaki 6 or 7 weeks after the damn thing was blown to bits. I'm not saying, my point is that he saw some of the carnage and some of the damage, and he says, I'm glad we beat Hitler, but Americans, it's not just a good war. Americans show a tremendous capacity for violence. And well, we can debate that in another whole seminar. And it sells well, etc. You can hit it. So I read the letters a number of years ago that people sent to Mailer, and they're saying, glad you wrote, not everybody is saying this, but I'm glad you wrote this. It shows the faults and the frailties of all human beings. Whoa, that means Americans are not exceptional. That's too bad Ray's not here to talk about Reinhold Niebuhr, but that we too have our faults. And others wrote there too many Americans were only interested in killing Japanese, which I said about Pearl Harbor. And there's a New York Times review of Mailer's book in '44, and it shows our disillusionment. Yes, there were people in America who were disillusioned by the good war because they showed human nature to have such a capacity for violence. And they didn't see it in any other way. You can hit it. I had to make this quickly. This is Indianapolis' own Kurt Vonnegut, writes one of the great novels of World War II, Slaughterhouse-Five. What a character he was. He used to come down to Bloomington and he'd tell the students not to trust authority, and they would all of a sudden they'd be on their feet clapping for him. I mean, he was a treasure. But Slaughterhouse-Five is all about World War II, and Vonnegut was in it. He was on a meat locker getting bombed in Dresden. It's all about the war, not only just traumatic memories, but that it's so hard to remember really did what happened because it's so complicated and everything. And others will say this, if somebody gives you a neat and clean story, don't believe them. That comes later. I think that's the best soldier memoir of World War II, William Manchester's Goodbye Darkness. And I want to stress that it makes that strong effort to show the horror, the carnage, the trauma of the battle, but also he now brings back honor, and he says, my generation felt a tremendous honor in defending our fighting for our country. I don't want to ever say that goes away with soldiers. It doesn't. And he's critical of the Vietnam generation because you can hit it again. He doesn't think that they had the same discipline and sense of patriotic honor. You could argue that, and there's a lot to say about that issue right now, and it's a fun issue about the patriotic attachments between those two wars. But Manchester is a good writer, and if any of you are interested in this stuff, or you're dealing with people in sessions, I would recommend that book if somebody wants to take the time to read it. You can hit it. I'll just zip through some of Vietnam and War and Terror books, but Caputo wrote about Vietnam. Again, it's more about the pain, the disillusionment, the suffering. You can hit it. He wrote a couple of books. A Rumor of War was quite well received, as those of you who know this stuff. But he really was sort of turned off by the fact that the U.S. was always issuing body counts. I'm old enough to remember hearing that stuff on TV, that the body counts today, we killed, 1,000 Viet Cong and we only had 11 losses or whatever. I mean, I'm not making fun of it, I'm just saying that it was news all the time. And in terms of just wars, Caputo raises that sort of moral issue that he feels a moral casualty because he regrets ordering to kill two Viet Cong and regrets other things that he had to do. He's basically talking about John Kennedy and this sort of myth that you have to do what you can do for your country. If anybody wants to go back and listen to Kennedy's inaugural speech, which is famous, it's really a clarion call to fight the Cold War. I mean, it's so much what it is. You can go on. Sorry. So I'm going to skip through this. This is more What you're getting more after Vietnam, a little bit after World War II, and after the war on terror, you're going to get a tremendous amount. You're getting more of the suffering of soldiers after they're home. That's one of the things that it's not just the monument to Vietnam showing you it's PTSD, it's all the post-war suffering. Now that's become and became a much more common part of the memory and the experience of war. You can go on. O'Brien, I remember I had O'Brien in a class down in Bloomington a number of years ago. He was really good. Everybody had read or wanted to read his book, and he's the one that's saying that anybody gives you a story that there is a good moral purpose or for our war, he says don't believe them. He wasn't going to buy that, and he was over there and was a veteran. You can hit it. James Webb I just wanted to put him in here quickly because he talks about PTSD and the suffering and what Webb also, like Manchester in World War II, Webb brings back the honor of serving for your country, and he became Secretary of the Webb. So again, you see the tension that we've been seeing through families and through politics and through the culture itself. And let's just go to the war on terror. Let me just, can you go back? Yeah, just real quick, and then I can definitely finish on time. The war on terror produced an industry of soldier and memoirs, both for men and women, by the way, because now women are serving and writing. And the record is extensive in terms of the moral confusion and emotional confusion and damage they felt. There's the bitter realities outweigh the patriotic heroism in most of these books, and they really question. You can hit this one, and the great sort of memoir. And there's others from the war on terror that is more about the honor of serving. The nobility of defending America, and by the way, a book that has a heavy amount of Christian thought or imagery or argumentation in there that there was something worthwhile in killing Muslims. There's a real Christian-Muslim thing which probably can drive the larger explanations of the war itself. And Kyle, who's now deceased, unfortunately, was killed by a veteran he was trying to help. His book is a massive bestseller, and they make the movie. There's Bradley Cooper, who's it's a hugely popular movie, and it's very patriotic. And I'm going to be bad on this. I hope I don't. I think in the book, Kyle doesn't talk about his PTSD, but I think the movie does reveal it. Do you remember that? If that was the case, I think the movie makers were more willing to sort of break that. Okay, next one. You can keep going because I just said that. And the other, I think the best novel I've read, and it's to me it's a soldier memoir because everything I'm giving you is written by veterans. Is Kevin Powers' novel The Yellowbirds. I used to sign it in classes. It's terrific. It's all about suffering after the war. The main character is back in Virginia, and all he can do is drink a case of beer a day, and he just can't function, basically. And that's not a myth. I mean, people are experiencing that. And I think you can go one more frame where and there's this point in that story in The Yellowbirds, which is so good, that the main character, who's I think is a stand-in for Powers, the author, his buddy would go to the camp wherever they were stationed in this town near Iraq, where they were the hospital, and they were watching the nurses treat these guys, and he was mesmerized by the fact that the nurses would render care and sort of compassion, and he saw it as compassion contrasted with the dehumanization of war. And he, after seeing this so many times, this soldier in the fiction, which is in a sense really not so much fictional, decides that it really is dehumanizing. He doesn't want to live anymore, and he walks into an Iraqi town at night knowing you're not going to walk out alive, And the next day, he and his buddies in the novel go in there, find his body, which has been brutalized, and they throw his body in a river in Iraq so it won't come home to receive patriotic honors, so as not to mislead people that there was really virtue and violence, virtue in the war itself. you don't have to accept that argument. God, that's an interesting point. And it's so resonant with all the sort of long-term tension we see throughout popular memory in terms of this sort of continual tension between, and I think one more, and I know I'm not doing gender equality here, but there's many more books by the guys than the girls, I'm sorry, the women. But the women have written some good stuff on the War on Terror, and Kayla Williams wrote 2 of them, and people like that are in this room can talk more about this than I can, but her book is, her war in part, the big part is about gender tensions, and being a woman in that particular situation. That's the way I read it. And there's a sense that women, some of them felt they had to prove themselves that they could be as good as the guys, etc. There's a really good book on 3 women from Indiana, by the way. If any of you want it, just please contact me and I'll give you the title inside of my head, but I put it in one of my footnotes last year. And Caleb Williams' second book, it's more again about this post-war struggles, because both her vet spouse and her have some real problems stemming from the war in their relationship, and I thought actually that was done quite well. So that's my presentation in terms of experiences of war are diffuse, but there's this sort of common theme of trying to turn the war into something it's not, and the insistence that you don't forget all that it was, et cetera.